This is Tony Blazer back with another video for the Motocross Vault here on YouTube. For this one, what we're going to do is we're going to look back at a motorcycle that a lot of us have ridden over the years. Certainly one of the most popular machines Honda ever built, the venerable XR250R. Not strictly a motocross bike, obviously, more of a kind of a woods play bike. Over the years, Honda kind of marketed it as a legitimate enduro machine. Really, that's maybe a stretch compared to like the two strokes and stuff that it kind of competed against. It was obviously much more of a play bike, but a super reliable, fun motorcycle. I actually had the 200. I never had the 250, but a good friend of mine's had the 250. I've ridden a lot of them over the years. They're super fun. Great bikes, pretty much indestructible as long as you change the oil in the darn things. And definitely one of the most iconic machines Honda's produced over the last 50 years or so. This is going to look at all the XRs from the time they started in 1979 through the 2004, which is the last year. We're going to talk a little bit about the significant models. Obviously a lot of them didn't change a ton from year to year. There are a few big steps where they would make some major changes to the model. But a lot of the time, the XRs just got bold new graphics and stuff. So I'm not going to get into details unless there's a significant change. But this will give you a good overview of the history of the model. Like I said, certainly one of the coolest bikes Honda did over the years, and one that a lot of us rode when we were younger. And I'm sure a lot of you guys still have them and ride them now. They're just fun bikes, which off-road riding should always be about fun. And if fun is the quotient, the XR is definitely one of the best machines you could own. So I hope you all enjoy it. If you do, subscribe and hit that little bell there to make sure you get updated when we do a new one. And here we go, the history of the Honda XR250R. As with other videos, I thought it'd be a good idea to go back to the beginning here and give a little context to the marketplace that the XR was introduced to in 1979. Honda, in 1972, actually introduced their first kind of off-road focused 250, not really an enduro bike, more of a dual sport bike, the original XL250. Now, at the time, most Japanese off-road motorcycles were just like this one. They're really kind of a dual sport. The Yamaha DT1 Enduro, a lot of Kawasaki's. They weren't really as serious off-road focused as later machines would be. They were kind of a jack of all trades. You could take the lights off here of the XL. It was designed to have the lights removed and kind of turn it into an off-road bike. Certainly not as narrow focused. Really much more of a universal Japanese motorcycles, they used to say. Even on the street end of things, they didn't have sport bikes. They didn't have cruisers. The Japanese kind of built do-it-all motorcycles. And the Enduro market here is very much the same kind of deal. This original XL was powered by a 250cc single-cylinder overhead cam engine, pretty advanced for its time. Honda was always a four-stroke company first since they had been started, and they were really specialized in this. At the time, almost all the Japanese motorcycles were exclusively two-stroke. That's street and dirt. Suzuki's street motorcycles are all two-strokes. Their off-road enduro bikes are two-strokes. Yamaha, same kind of deal. But Honda kind of clung to the four-stroke ideal. That gave it an improved reliability. It was certainly easier to service. Kind of led to that whole idea that you meet the nicest people on the Hondas. The Hondas were quiet, they didn't stink, they didn't break down. Good, reliable bikes, kind of the same thing they're known for now. In 1973, Honda bucked that four-stroke trend by introducing their first competition two-stroke motorcycle, the original XR250M Elsinore. This was obviously a major break at the time from Honda's kind of internal doctrine. Mr. Honda had famously fought the idea of having a two-stroke, but seeing the writing on the wall with Suzuki's excellent success on the GP scene in the motocross arena, they realized that a four-stroke wasn't going to cut it for motocross racing at the time. So they went ahead and developed a full-on competition two-stroke. In 1974, Honda added a second two-stroke to the lineup with the revolutionary XR125M Elsinore. The 125 version was even more popular than the 250 and really set a new bar for Japanese performance in the small bore class. In 1975, the success of the 125CR was followed up with a new enduro version, the MR175. The 175 had a lot of the DNA of the CR in it, but it added lights and some other enduro equipment. It was certainly much more serious than the XLs and stuff in terms of off-road ability. A lot of guys took some CR stuff and stuck them on there and kind of made a pretty potent off-road, lightweight off-road machine out of it. In 1976, The MR175 was joined by an all-new 250 version. The all-new MR250 was based on the CR line and featured a motocross-style chassis with some added enduro equipment. The tank was larger at 3.4 gallons. It also added things like a speedometer, off-road tuned suspension, and a carburetor that featured what they called a power jet. I can only assume this is not the same power jet that was found on a 1997 XR250. In spite of the name, I don't think they had the sophisticated electronics in 1976 to make that work. One interesting thing to notice about the MR is the fact that Honda saw fit to put the Elsinore name on it. Unlike the 175, the 250 does get the official Elsinore name. So you can tell they're kind of trying to trade on their kind of the cachet of the CR line with the MR. The bike obviously was designed to be off-road first. It has lights and stuff and enduro tuned suspension, but it was certainly much more serious than an XL and a pretty potent machine with once you put a little bit of some CR stuff on. A lot of people found it to be a pretty good bike that year. Interestingly, though, Honda only saw fit to build it this 1 year. The MR 175 did go on for 1977, but the 250 version only made it this 1 year, so it's really a unique and rare motorcycle today. After a couple of years off, Honda re-entered the 250 Enduro market in 1979 with an all-new machine, the XR250. Now, what set this bike apart from most of its competition was the fact that it was powered by a four-stroke single and not a two-cycle. The PEs, ITs, all the Husqvarnas, KTMs slash Pentons at the time were powered by two strokes. Getting back to their four-stroke roots, Honda decided to go with a four-stroke single for this new off-road motorcycle. Using a 249cc single overhead cam, 4-valve per cylinder engine, this new motor design featured a pent roof head and a certainly more sophisticated valve train than the original XL and 72 had used. Now, by modern four-stroke standards, this motor looks pretty simple, but in 1979 it was pretty advanced. A lot of four-strokes still were using two-valve heads. It doesn't have a dual overhead cam design, but again, for the time, this was a pretty advanced motor design. At a claimed 252 pounds, the new XR was substantially heavier than some of its two-stroke competition, but that wasn't an outrageous amount when you compared it to like an XL or some of the street legal versions of the Honda's lineup. The bike did have dual shocks in the back. They were considered long travel for the time. They're certainly not as long travel as like what was found on a CR that year, but for an enduro bike, it wasn't bad. The suspension was very soft, though. They tried to market this thing really as a serious enduro bike, but if you were to put up against, like a serious bike from Europe, a Husqvarna or something, the XR was certainly way down on power. The main problem was the motor and stuff was pretty mild. The bike was actually much heavier probably than the 252 they claimed. It was closer in weight to the 500cc version. Really, there wasn't much of a weight savings between the two. The bike was really more of a play bike. It was very heavy, slow, not really much real competition for anybody on a serious two-stroke at the time. The main advantage was the motor was very reliable. It didn't have the frequent maintenance. You didn't need to tear it apart and rebuild it like you would a two-stroke all the time. The bike basically, as long as you kept the oil in it, it ran and ran and ran. But it was certainly heavier and way down on power compared to anything else it would be going up against. In addition to having a unique power plant, this first edition of the XR had a few other little quirks to it that set it apart from the competition. The first thing was it used a 23-inch front wheel, which was, in Honda's idea at the time, going to give it a little better tracking in the rough. They thought it would roll over roots and rocks and logs better. In practice, it just kind of gave the bike a strange handling feel. I don't think most people really cared for the 23-inch wheel. They also tried it on the CR125 that year, and it was pretty quickly dropped. It also had very limited tire selection due to the fact that it was an oddball size. Now, Honda did address this by actually introducing their own tire that year. It was called the Claw Action Tire. They had a version for the Motocross line and the Enduro line. It was supposed to, improve traction and yada, yada, yada. But very much like the other quirks of the bike, it was pretty much panned by all the press. I don't think anybody much cared for the Claw Action Tire, and it was dropped by, I think, 1981. I think 80 they used it as well, and they dropped it in 81. For 1980, the XR line remained largely unchanged. The only real significant change was upgrade in displacement on the XR185 to a XR200. I actually had an XR200, this exact one you see here on the left. Fun little bike. I tried to motocross it quite a bit and ended up breaking the frame repeatedly, but it was a fun little motorcycle, just not really made for that. The XR500 and the 250 kept the 23-inch wheel for 1980, and like I said, we're basically unchanged, not much difference. I always thought this front number plate light combo was pretty weird looking on these. Definitely not one of my favorite designs, but the XRs did have a lot of cool features. They had folding shift levers, folding brake levers, features you would not often found on motocross bikes. Nice stuff that you'd have to get from the aftermarket. The tool pouch was a nice touch. Speedometer was built in there for enduro use, so it was pretty well equipped little motorcycle. Just didn't have a lot of outright performance. In 1981, Honda dialed up its first major redesign of the XR line. Both the XR250 and XR500 got a total makeover that year. The chassis, bodywork, the looks, everything was all new. It featured a new single shock rear suspension system, which was very similar to what was found on the Honda Motocross line that year. Honda chose to call their system the ProLink, and it featured a large single damper connected to a rising rate linkage below the shock. Now, the idea behind the ProLink and all the rising rate linkages that you see today is to give the shock a more progressive action, to give it the ability to absorb small impacts and follow the train easily on small stuff while still giving it sufficient bottoming resistance on large hits. The problem with the dual shock design was a couple of things. It tended to be wider in the middle. It was definitely had a wider profile. The single shock gave the bike a slimmer profile through the middle, and it was difficult to get it to both absorb small stuff and not bottom out. So the idea behind the linkage was obviously to give you a wider range of control on hitting obstacles. Now, the ProLink on the CRs was a little more advanced than what was found on the XRs here. The shock wasn't quite as good. It did offer 4 adjustments for rebound damping. There was no compression damping adjustable on it. It did have a remote reservoir. Basically, this was a pretty significant upgrade at the time. It was pretty trick that the XRs got it the same year that the CRs did. Now, there is a differential here. If you notice, the XR250 and XR500 get the R designation this year, and that kind of sets them apart from the regular XRs. In the literature, it basically says these are the more race-ready models. The regular XR200, some of the other ones just did not get the R in their name that year. They were considered more, obviously, play bikes. And again, Honda is still trying to basically, market this as a race-ready machine, even though realistically, if you were a serious racer, the XR250 was probably not your first choice. The 500 was a pretty good, desert bike. It was pretty good for that, but the 250 still at this point is using the same pent roof, 4-valve engine, and it's pretty down on power. At this point, 252 strokes were much more powerful than a 254 stroke would be. It's nothing like you'd see today where the 4 strokes are putting out very similar power. This engine's very simple, reliable, but certainly not a powerhouse. The new suspension was tricked, but it didn't do a whole lot to make the bike really much more competitive against the 2 strokes. 2 other little tidbits to mention for 81. You'll notice that the front tire is now a 21-inch hoop, so that they did ditch the weird 23-inch in 1981 when they redesigned the bike, but they also went with another strange choice. They went with a 17-inch rear. Like the 23, this did give it a limited selection of rear tires. I guess Honda was steadfast in having an oddball combination on their XRs for some reason. I do imagine the 17 maybe gave you a little more sidewall protection, kind of similar to what 18 versus 19 on a modern bike, but it definitely limited the amount of tires you could choose. So if you're riding XR, you were going to be getting some weird tires in 1981. After the total redesign in 1981, the 82 XR was really just a bold new graphics deal. As you can see, the side panel here has changed from black to white. The graphics are slightly different, but other than that, it's exactly the same motorcycle as it was the year before. For 1983, Honda chose not to offer an XR250R and instead decided to focus on a new mid-size model, the XR350R. The heart of this new machine would be a redesigned 4-stroke, 4-valve engine. Honda would coin the RFVC, which stood for radial 4-valve combustion. Now this new motor used a hemispherical combustion chamber, a narrow angle set of valves, and a centrally located spark plug to provide a faster and more efficient burn than the old pent roof design. It still had a single overhead cam. There was no dual overhead cam in it, but it was a little more efficient design overall. The bike was redesigned as well. The 350 and the 500 this year had all new bodywork, a new look as well. They went from the Tahitian red, which is a dark kind of a blood red, to a new, more orangey red, and a blue seat here, which more closely mimicked what was on the Honda CRs and the Honda Works bikes in '82. Personally, I think this is my favorite color combination of any of the XRs, and I love the looks of these mid-'80s models. For 1984, Honda's XR250R was back with an all-new design. Unlike previous XR250s, this new model was based on the smaller, more nimble XR200 platform. Previous XRs had been based largely on the 500 chassis, which was great for like big wide open spaces like Baja and such, but made the bike kind of heavy and unwieldy in the trees. The 200, while significantly less powerful, actually handled better in these situations and was a lot easier to manhandle in the kind of tight eastern conditions you would want the 254. The side benefit of downsizing everything was a pretty huge, significant savings as well in weight. The 84 model was a whopping 34 pounds lighter than the 82 250, which was a huge difference. The new motor maintained the RFVC configuration that was used on the 83, 350, and 500, and also maintained the dual carb setup that motor used. Now, that basically was a system that allowed one carburetor to function at low RPMs to give you a good response. At a certain point, the second carb system would kick in and give the motors additional fuel to give you a good top-end pull. In theory, that was a pretty great system, but it could be kind of persnickety to get right. It was really easy to get those two carbs out of sync. Some people weren't super big fans of that setup, but if you got it working right, it was a very efficient system. On the chassis side of things, the XR250 shared the same 53.7-inch wheelbase as the 200. This gave it a very nimble feel, excellent turning in the trees, but probably not the best high-speed stability for going bombing across the desert. Both bikes shared the same 10 inches of travel in the front and 9.6 inches in the rear. This was obviously short of what you would have found on a motocross bike at the time, but more than sufficient for the kind of enduro, tight woods stuff that you would probably want an XR250 for. The bike did have a front disc brake for 84. That's what was all new on the 250. Rear was still a drum. In the shock, the ProLink did offer compression and rebound adjustability. That was new, but the suspension was still pretty soft on these things. I mean, if you were going to try any jumps, you're probably going to bottom out pretty hard. Like I said earlier, I broke the frame on my 200 several times. My buddy who had a 250 a year or two after this, we broke the frame on it many times. Any kind of motocross use for these bikes was really ill-advised unless you were going to completely revamp the suspension, in spite of the fact that the basic components look similar to what you would have found on the motocross bike. The settings and stuff were way different, and it just wasn't up for that kind of use. But if you're going to just kind of plonk around in the woods and go over roots and stuff, it was very plush and real good for that. While this redesign was considered a success in most ways, there was one major flaw with it. In four-stroke design, there are kind of two separate basic designs for carrying the oil. What would be known as like a wet sump, which is where the motor carries the oil inside of it, and a dry sump where there is an external oil tank. Now that can be employed for several reasons. On a race car, you'd use that usually to keep the oil cool and also to keep the G-forces from slinging all the oil out of the motor to make sure it gets proper lubrication. You'd see that in like a Corvette or something. On a motorcycle, typically it's more the case of you want to cool it. You want to give a little more oil capacity and also give it the oil somewhere to go to cool off. Well, these early 80s XRs used a wet sump motor, meaning it carried all the oil inside that motor, and they suffered from some overheating issues. As you can see, the motor is air-cooled to start up with, which was really simplistic, meaning you couldn't bash a radiator and get stranded, but the motors tended to run hot, and these early wet sump ones, they ran really hot. The valve springs were also a little bit soft, and once that thing got hot, it was real easy to float the valves and roach the motor. So in general, while XRs have a pretty bulletproof reputation, These 83 to 85 ones were not the best. There was definitely some problems there. If you ever happen to try and buy one, make sure you're careful because if it's pretty old, chances are pretty good the valve train might be roached on it. For 1985, both the XR250R and XR200R were back in Honda's lineup with only very, very minor updates. Visually, there were some new graphics, which I actually happen to love. I love this red, white, and blue Honda wing. This was the first year for that design. Really great look on the XRs and the CRs that year. There's also a set of fork boots that are now blue instead of black, and the shock spring was blue. Other than that, it's just minor jetting changes overall between the 2 years. Not a lot of difference. The motor, as you can see here, only put out a very meager output. This engine was not a powerhouse by any means by 4-stroke standards or 2-stroke. Most 80s probably could give the give this XR a run for its money in terms of total output at 20.8 horsepower. Not a powerhouse, but it was a good little torquey motor. As before, this engine is a wet sump design. It's basically exactly the same as what they had in '84. So you had to stay on top of oil. You had to watch it like a hawk and be careful not to overheat the darn thing and then roach your valves. The bike continued to be very softly suspended. Suspension again was tuned for off-road use only, so it wasn't up for any serious bombing through the whoops or jumps. Certainly were really not on the agenda. Bike did handle well, like I said. The XR 200 and 250 had the exact same chassis. They're very, very nimble bikes for their weight and size. Good turning machines, good woods bikes. While the 250 was relegated to minor changes for 1985, there was a all-new XR in the Honda stable for '85. The XR250R was back with a whole slew of improvements aimed at addressing the overheating issues and reliability issues of the earlier machines. The new bike had a all-new motor in it that used a smaller bore and a larger stroke to give it a little more torque. And they also went to a dry sump oil configuration, which, like I said earlier, allowed the oil to be kept cooler. This was a real big improvement because, like I said, the overheating was a major problem on the 350 as well as the 250. One other thing they did with this new redesign was to switch from the complicated dual carbs to a single carb. It went from the dual carbs of '84 to a simpler single 35 millimeter carb. This obviously eased tuning, made it a lot easier to get the bike to run really well. In addition to the motor changes, the '85 XR350 featured all new bodywork. Really, really good looking stuff. At least for my money, this is the best looking of any of the XRs ever. I love this color combo. I love the orange, love the blue, the yellow plates. Just everything about it was just great. I think by most people's standards, this is probably the best XR of the '80s. This '85 350 was really a great machine in a lot of ways. Kind of captured the not too big, not too small kind of middleweight thing and got a lot of things right in 1985. For 1986, Honda discontinued the XR350 and poured all that they had learned the year before into an all-new XR250R. First up on the list of changes for '86 were an all-new motor that was aimed at beefing up the torque on the previously rev-happy 250. Learning from what they had worked on the year before, Honda decreased the bore and increased the stroke of the 249cc mill. Overall displacement remained the same, but now it was an over square 73 by 59.5 millimeters. The new motor retained the air-cooled design of the old layout, but it did add an external oil cooler. This was an important addition considering the overheating issues of the previous engine. The overall oil capacity was also bumped up slightly, but the 250 did not get the external oil tank the '85 350 had used. The new long-stroke motor maintained the same radial 4-valve combustion chamber 4-valve head that it had used since 1984 and added a new 30mm Keihin single carburetor to simplify tuning. On the chassis side of things, the '86 XR250 featured an all-new frame. You can see it here superimposed in white over the '85 chassis. The new bodywork that went with it was very similar to the 1985 XR350 bodywork. It was all new, although I will say I much prefer the looks of the 85. Like I said, this 86 redesign with the slightly different red and the white fenders, I was never a fan of that. I like the 85 look a lot better. But this bodywork is much cleaner in design, in my opinion, than what was on the previous, the 85s. Even though I like the color combination better, this bodywork is better looking. The chassis was much roomier than 85. The bike was larger overall. Wheelbase was up a full 3.5 inches over 85, so it was significantly larger. This was to give, I guess, the bike a little more, a little more wide range of use. Suspension was all new for 1986 as well. The forks were significantly upgraded. In 85, they had used a 38 millimeter fork. The new Kayabas were 41 millimeters in size. They were very similar in design to what was found on the 85 XR125R, but 2 millimeters smaller overall. A new ProLink rear was also bolted up. That ditched the previous steel swing arm for a lightweight aluminum one, which was nice, something very trick and similar to what you'd find on the CRs. Overall travel was also bumped up from 9.6 inches in 1985 to a full 11 inches for 1986, which is still about an inch or so less than what you would have got on a CR, but pretty good for essentially a glorified trail bike. In terms of performance, the new XR motor was not a quantum leap better than previous XR250s, but it did run better on the trail. Horsepower was up a little over 1 horsepower, but the torque curve was much flatter. Low end power was much better. Previous one had like a little dip midway through the curve. This had a much flatter, stronger torque curve. The response was better. The bike ran much cleaner with the single carb. It was a much better motor, even though on paper it didn't look like it was a huge improvement. Compared to two-strokes, of course, it was still way down on power. Any KTM 250 or Husqvarna or a converted motocrosser, certainly you wouldn't want to come up against one of them on the trail. It was no match for anything like that. But for plunking through the trees, it was still an excellent little motor for that. Pretty much indestructible. The new oil cooler helped a lot. There were much less issues with any kind of head problems and stuff with these. Overall, the motor was a little bit more powerful and a whole lot more reliable. Good little fun motor. Like I said, you could scream the bejeebers out of it all day long, and it would just keep on trucking. Suspension was improved, but the bike still was really soft. If you were going to try any aerial antics like this, you were going to come to a pretty strong thud when the XR came down. It really was much better for kind of plonking through the trees at a medium pace. Any kind of high-flying antics were likely to bottom the suspension out. And like I can tell you from my buddy who had one of these, it would snap the frame. The steel on these is not nearly as strong as what was used on the CRs, and the frame would fatigue and crack if you really tried to pound the tar out of them. It really wasn't made for that kind of stuff. But overall, this 86 redesign was a huge improvement in most respects. The bike was more reliable, it handled better, had a little more power, suspension was improved. Really a significant upgrade in the XRs. And actually this basic design would basically stay the same for the next 10 years. It would also be the basis for the very popular XR 250L dual sport as well. Good design, like I said, not a powerhouse motor by any means. Not as powerful as the 350, but a really good little middleweight bike. After the total redesign of 1986, the XR250 was back for 1987 with only very minor graphic updates. The font of the seat is a little bit different, and the graphics on the tank are different. Other than that, it is identical in every way to the 86. I do like this graphic a little bit better, but again, I much prefer the iconic Honda wing logo like they had in 85. I'm not sure why these didn't get it. The CRs this year, 87, had a really great look. I always kind of lamented the fact that the XRs didn't get that color combo and that look. They should have kept the orange fenders and stuff and went with the iconic wing, in my opinion. But anyway, I wasn't running Honda, so what do I have to say about it? Now, for 1988, the XR again, bold new graphics is all of it. Again, don't really care for the graphics this year. That's not my favorite. The 88s in general, didn't really like the XR look this year. You can see the fender is red. The seat is still blue, and they changed the fork boots from blue to red. But other than that, the motor is basically identical. One thing I do like, the 88 bike, they kind of changed the color of the side case a little bit. It's a little deeper bronze. But again, it's all just minor styling stuff. Mechanically, these These three machines are identical, 86, 87, 88, really no differences at all. Now for 89, the XR was back again with what is really just another cosmetic update. But for my money, this is probably my second favorite XR of all times in terms of appearance. This change to the kind of CR look where it's all one color, monochromatic red, got rid of the white fenders and stuff, brought the Honda wing back to the tank. Two thumbs up for me on that. I like the XR logo. It's very CR this year. This is what they should have done in 88 and they should have done in 87, was kind of mimic the CR look. Kept the gold rims on it and stuff like the CRs had in 87. But anyway, Honda got it right in 89. All the XRs had a real purposeful CR look, and I just love the looks of it. Like I said, no mechanical changes, but all cosmetic. But this is just a really good looking bike. Honda really knocked it out of the park in 89 with all their bikes. It's certainly one of the best looking ones, and right up there with 85 in terms of, really, you almost could rank it above it, really, because the monochromatic look is a little more professional than the blue and the orange and all the other stuff they had going on. But for me, it'd be kind of a toss-up, I think. Great looking motorcycle, great looking XR. For 1990, the XR250R was back with some minor and major improvements. Overall bodywork and frame, motor, all that stuff was the same, but the suspension was upgraded both front and rear. Up front, the XR received a all-new 41mm cartridge fork. Cartridge forks basically allowed for a more consistent damping, a wider range of control over a damper rod style. It had been used on the Motocross CR since 1986, and by 1990, all the major motocross bikes were using a cartridge design. The 41mm forks on the XR were a little bit smaller than what you would have found on a motocross bike, but it did provide a major improvement in damping control. In the rear, the the ProLink rear was only subtly changed. They had some tweaks to the rear suspension settings, not a big deal. The rear exhaust was also tweaked for 1990 to give it a little more power. The other major change for 90 was the rear disc brake. The addition of a rear disc addressed one of the kind of last holdovers from the old XR that were kind of a downer. The drum brake worked okay when it was fresh and stuff, but if you got it wet or it got hot, it got kind of grabby and squeaky, and if you get it really wet, it would go away. So the addition of a disc gave you more consistent braking control and was not affected by things like water and mud and such. One of the interesting thing to point out for 1990 is the addition of some competition. Suzuki brought out an all-new bike, the XR250, in 1990. A few years earlier, all the other Japanese brands had kind of abandoned the 254 stroke class. At one point, you had the XT250, you had a KLR 250, you had of course, the Honda, and Suzuki had a DR as well. But in the late 80s, they all kind of abandoned it and left the whole market to Honda. But for 1990, Suzuki was back with an all-new machine. Much like the XR, it wasn't a very serious machine. It wasn't like a race bike by any means, although some people did try to race them. The XR and the DR were both more trail bike than race bike, but a lot of people had fun trying to turn them into serious racers and sunk quite a bit of money into that probably fruitless endeavor. For 1991, we get a switch from the orange tank to the white. Personally, I'm not a fan of this switch. I like the orange tank. Actually, I like all the orange bodywork better than the white. Never a big fan of the white. Didn't really like this blue side panel either. The other difference is we get new disc brakes for 1991. They switch from a slot-style rotor to a rotor with holes in it. This is said to improve braking. I'm not sure how. It seems like over the years, all the manufacturers kind of switch back and forth. I have no idea why one would work better than another. I suppose maybe there's a little more surface area, but then why do we not just stick with one? But be that as it may, for 91 they said that. They also claim to have very bold new graphics, although I would say, like I said, the absence of the Honda wing is not a good thing. The brochure also says they redesigned the rear hub, although I'm not sure if that was just to accommodate the new rotor or if there was some other purpose to it. It doesn't really say. It just says it's redesigned, so it must be new and awesome. Before we move on to 1992, I did want to mention one other machine in the Honda stable for 91, the all-new XR250L. This was a dual sport version of the XR and was basically the off-road version with blinkers and taillights. The XR actually already came with some of these features in other countries where in Europe and such you could drive basically dirt bikes on the street. But here in America we couldn't really do that. So this was a really cool dual sport, and really the first kind of serious kind of off-road dual sport in quite some time, maybe since the early 70s when the DT1 was offered. Earlier XLs were really mostly street bike. The suspension, the hardware, all that stuff was downgraded from what you would have found on the off-road only version. Definitely had the XR look, but it didn't have the performance of an XR. So this XRL was a really cool bike. It's a bike I've always wanted to own. I almost bought one a couple years ago. I still kick myself in the rear for not buying it, but cool motorcycle, cool dual sport. Certainly not up to the same levels as what you'd find on a KTM or something now, but for its time, a very, very interesting model. After 1991, there aren't any real significant changes in the XR line for another few years. The 92, 93, 94, and 95 XRs here are basically just bold new graphics, or as the brochure puts it, aggressive new graphics. Every year's a little bit different. They kept the same color bodywork even, didn't really change it much. About the only thing you'll notice changing is the blue on the side plates here get a little deeper as they're kind of shifting towards purple. Purple mania was catching on in the mid 90s, and it started to infect the XRs here as well. Here's by 1995, you can see the side plate is fully purple. The graphics are a little more cartoony, kind of indicative of the time. While this is certainly a little bit bolder, it is way less aggressive than the purple CRs this year. This year, the Honda CRs were pretty crazy looking. They had purple shrouds, purple plastic. It was just a crazy look. I'm not sure what the heck they were smoking over there at Honda in 95, but this is the last year for the XR with this body style. This basic design lasted almost 10 years here, so it was definitely much more successful than the earlier ones where they were kind of getting retired after one or two. So probably one of the most enduring XR designs for sure, and definitely one that people think of fondly now. For 1996, the XR 250R was back with an all-new design. Everything from the fenders to the wheels to the motor was completely new. Graphics were new. I love this look. It's a great looking motorcycle. It does incorporate a lot of kind of purple, but it was the 90s after all, and 95, 96 purple was still in. The motor was redesigned this year. It still used the radial 4-valve combustion chamber design, the head design they'd used since the early 80s, but the new motor was a dry sump configuration. As we discussed earlier, that means that the oil was carried in the frame in a separate tank. This allowed the Honda to carry both more capacity and to cool it better. Because of this, this new model deleted the oil cooler that had been used on the previous XR250. Externally, the motor looked very similar to 1995, but internally there were several changes aimed at improving power and reliability. In the head, the valve timing was new and offered a higher lift to the exhaust valve. The spark plug was relocated and actually shrunk down. It was much smaller, giving you a little more room for the valves to work. The piston rings actually were narrower and lighter, as well as the valve stems were also reduced in size slightly to allow the motor to rev a little more freely. Carburetor was new, and it was a 30mm single carburetor, so it kept the single carb design of the earlier XRs. The internal parts of the motor were also updated. The clutch was new, transmission was new, the counterbalancer and stuff was still maintained, but all that stuff internally was new. So even though the motor, like I said, looked very similar to the previous one, inside it was all new. The motor was actually a little shorter this year too. It was a half-inch shorter overall. They did a lot of things with this new XR to try and centralize mass. Keep the weight down a little bit lower. So like I said, shortening the motor was an important feature there. Also, that's one of the reasons they deleted the oil cooler. That was something that set up behind the steering stem on the previous model. So by deleting that, that was some more stuff they could get down lower on the chassis. Like I said, on the chassis side of things, the frame was all new and incorporated that oil tank. They did have a rear subframe that was removable for the first time. Earlier XRs did not have this kind of motocross style feature. On the suspension end, the XR250 featured all new suspension front and rear. The fork was a cartridge design as it had been for the previous 4 or 5 years, but it was all new. It maintained the 41mm design of previous models, but featured an all new design that was made to have less overhang below the axles. This was something that earlier kind of conventional forks had an issue with, where they would catch in ruts. Certainly a big concern on a bike designed to go in the woods and through the mud and stuff. So this new design was kind of one of the new age conventional forks that were very similar in looks to what was used on the 1996 RMs as well. Kind of a very lower, stubby lower end, really didn't extend past the lower axle much more than like an upside down fork would have. But the conventional fork provided more flex, give you a little more comfort on the trail. The XR250 had a stablemate this year as well, the XR400, which was all new. The 400, though, used a very similar looking fork, but it was larger in design. It was a 43 millimeter unit that was actually built by Shawa. The one on the XR250 was a Kiaba unit. So even though they looked similar, the one on the 400 actually worked a lot better. The 400 in general was set up more aggressively than the 250. The 250 remained kind of the trail bike in the stable. The 400 got things like a removable clutch. It actually had the oil cooler on it. Much stiffer suspension. A lot of things that were designed to make it kind of more of a serious off-roader. The 250 remained, really a play bike at heart, even though like they continued to say you could kind of race it in an enduro. But if you were going to ride anything above the novice class, even this new XR probably wasn't the hot setup for that. The motor was a little torquier down low, revved a little higher on top. Peak output was really not much different. Through the middle, it ran the same. It was still not a powerhouse. You really kind of revved her up, but if you wanted to plonk around in the trees, it worked well for that. Suspension continued to be very soft. This new cartridge fork in the front was damp, set up for really just kind of plonk along in the roots. The shock in back was all new. They said it was more like a CR damper, but again, it was set up so soft, it really wasn't made for any kind of hard charging. If you were going to do any major aerial work, as in previous years with the XR, this new one wasn't really going to do much more than bottom out pretty hard. It wasn't really made for that kind of stuff. It was a great trail bike, though. Really good trail bike. The new ergonomics were much smoother. The tank is narrower, even though it has the same 2.5 gallon capacity as the old one. Compared to a motocross bike, the tank was kind of bulbous and wouldn't let you slide forward really well. I know as once the 400 was out, a lot of guys got into kind of turning these things into motocross bikes, which, this you got to remember, this is 2 years before the YZ400 comes out. So people wanting to race four-stroke motocrossers, which was quite a novelty at that time when everybody else was on two strokes. They got into kind of converting these XR400s into motocrossers, and A-Loop created a tank that was basically a modified CR tank that you could stick on here to kind of smooth the ergonomics out. But compared to previous XRs, it was a pretty big improvement. Overall, both the new XR400R and the redesigned XR250R were pretty major step forwards for the XR line. Both these bikes were hugely popular this year. Great machines if you're not looking for something that's a pure racer. Reliability, power, suspension on the 400 was pretty good. On the 250, definitely skewed more towards a play bike, but if you're looking to have something fun that was reliable, you wanted it to be a four-stroke and not a two-stroke, you couldn't really go wrong with an XR in 1996. Unfortunately, after 1996, the XR wouldn't receive any more major improvements. It would never receive an upside-down fork or a redesigned liquid-cooled motor. It basically stayed true to its kind of play bike roots until its final retirement a few years later. They did ditch the purple here. As you can see, the later 90s ones were basically red and black as the primary color. Still good looking motorcycles. I do prefer here this 2000 one here with the all red look. It's reminiscent of the 89 that I love so much. One weird little thing you'll notice here is for some reason the 2000 has a tool bag on it. I don't know why. Only the 2000 has it and none of the others do. You'll see here at 2001 they took it back off. So anyway, somebody in the budget had a tool bag that one year and then it went away. 2002, 2003, 2004, all identical. None of these bikes had any difference other than bold new graphics. Like I said, I do like the all red look, but by this point the XR was getting a little long in the tooth. In 2004, Honda finally retired the XR after many years of loyal service. It was replaced in the lineup by the all-new CRF 250X, a bike with much more racing pretensions than the XR ever had. Whether that's good or bad is up to you. Kind of a bone of contention to some people, I'm sure, that Honda doesn't build a motorcycle quite like this anymore. But in any case, the XR had a great run. It was a great motorcycle for a long time. Made a lot of people happy. Definitely a fun motorcycle over the years. It was never much of a racer, never much of a high-performance machine, but If you're looking for good, solid, reliable, fun, and inexpensive, they weren't real expensive too. Uh, Bikes just made for having fun, which is what riding dirt bikes is all about in my book. The XR was a great choice. If you enjoyed this, please remember to subscribe and ding that bell. Let you know when we do another one. If you have any ideas on what you'd like to see going forward, please feel free to drop me a line. My address is at Tony Blazer on Twitter and Instagram. That's TonyBlazier. And I do read the comments here too, so drop me a line if there's something else you'd like to see me do going forward. If I have the information and the photos and stuff to make it work, I will be happy to do that. So I hope you enjoyed this, and until we meet again, keep the rubber side down.